Hi, and welcome to Customizing Tablets for Dedicated Business Use, a webinar presented by Samsung. My name is Shane Schick. I'm a journalist who writes a lot about cybersecurity as well as IT management, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. When I first got my hands on a tablet, I'll admit that I didn't fully appreciate at first its potential to be used across different areas of a business. As a writer, I just saw a screen, something that would give me a larger surface for reading, but not necessarily a replacement for the kinds of things I would do on my laptop or through paper processes. Over the last number of years, though, organizations have demonstrated incredible ingenuity in using tablets as a key part of digital transformation. Some of that has to do with the innate features of the hardware, like the fact that they're so light and have a battery that can last a long time, and they're intuitive to use when you're on the go. But to do those things, they need to be able to be configured and customized so that they're not just consumer devices, and that's where these tools come in. Beyond that, though, IT departments and line of business teams have been able to do more from a customization perspective thanks to the introduction of tools that were designed to help them address otherwise huge management issues. This, of course, includes Samsung's Knox Configure, which offers a cloud-based service to simplify and enable a variety of out-of-the-box experiences. We'll get into more details about the features of Knox and how they can be applied across various use cases a bit later in this webinar. Presenting alongside me today is Joel Snyder. Joel is a PhD and a senior IT consultant with more than 30 years of practice. He's an internationally recognized expert in areas like security, messaging, and networks. He's also a popular speaker and author and is known for his unbiased and comprehensive tests of security and networking products. Joel's clients include major organizations across 6 continents. There's probably more ground we could cover here that could possibly fit into a webinar, but some of the main elements we're going to be touching upon will include the following. We're going to talk about the main business drivers for customizing tablets in the first place. We're going to offer a 5-point plan for getting started. We'll talk about some of the use cases that you can consider. And of course, we'll also talk about how you can use Knox Configure to specifically achieve some of those business objectives. Whether or not your organization is actually pursuing a digital transformation, the most successful companies are often focused on how they can create better customer experiences and empower their employees to play a bigger role in those experiences. A lot of the attributes of tablets I mentioned earlier are really helping in this area, given that they can make it much easier to find and display information or capture data in a way that avoids paper-based approaches, while bringing all the benefits of mobile computing. Some of the examples here include things like using tablets for conference room controls, hospital patient record management, field service data capture, retail point-of-sale terminals, and hospitality order taking. The big difference between tablets in the way consumers use them versus a business, of course, is the degree of customization that's required. A tablet might come with features that just aren't necessary in the enterprise and might even get in the way of the experience an organization is trying to create. So, Joel, why should you configure?
Shane, thanks. You need to configure because what you're doing is you're turning a consumer device, what you talked about, into a customized device. Now, in the old days, you would use custom hardware for that. It could be expensive, hard to find, lock you in. But now, because tablets have this huge consumer pull, we have this enormous marketplace of incredible products, and you can accomplish the same result that used to require customized hardware by using off-the-shelf hardware and customizing instead in software. And so that's why you need configuration. You're accomplishing what used to require custom hardware and software by just configuring down at the software layer.
So why should you use a tool like this? What are the main benefits?
Well, the tool is required because of consistency and efficiency. I mean, obviously you could log on to every tablet and do it all by hand and hope that you didn't make any mistakes and that no one made any errors in the configuration, but with a tool, you get consistent and efficient deployment. Remember, you're always going to be fighting with the nature of the device, these general purpose tablets. And also, you're going to be taking advantage of the sophistication of the user community, these digital natives that are very, very comfortable using tablets and are comfortable with these applications. So we have to support their their patterns of use, the pattern expectation they have, and their experience, but we have to deliver a very precise application. And that requires a tool that will give us control and repeatability. And of course, there's also security is a big issue. These tablets are going to be gateways to corporate data, corporate information. So they have to have very tight security controls, not just for compliance purposes, but to make sure that we're blocking any kind of potential data breach, any sort of data corruption. So mitigating these risks with a tool that gives you a clearly documented, a clearly repeatable process, that's what InfoSec people call a control. That's a best practice in the industry. And a configuration tool that lets you have repeatable processes, that becomes a best practice for solving security potential issues or avoiding security issues. So having something that can apply repeatable and controllable policies to devices is important to deliver something that everyone, including the InfoSec team, is going to find acceptable.
Thanks, Joel. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk more specifically about how organizations can do this successfully. The need to customize tablets begins with a specific business problem or use case in mind, and that usually means a specific application or applications. This webinar won't get into how to develop custom apps for all of the potential use cases. That would be quite a task. But it's important to note that there are important decisions to be made around applications before you get to the details or device customization. Joel, what's the best way for companies to make sure they're choosing or developing the right applications?
Shane, it's really not any different in the application world than the rest of the IT world. You always have to start with your requirements first. Now, it's very, very tempting to dive into the world of mobile apps because there's this incredible richness and breadth of applications, lots and lots of wonderful products out there. But if you find a product first, then you might end up with a solution that's looking for a problem to solve. So the best approach is, honestly, the old traditional approach. Sit down, think about the end state that you're looking for. You can use personas, you can use storytelling, whatever it is that you use in your organization, and then based on that, you fold forward toward the application. And at that point, you can decide whether to buy or build.
After you've addressed the app you want to deliver, you also need to think about the hardware or the device that you're going to run it on. Samsung actually offers an online tool, which we're showing here, that can help you consider all the options, whether it's focusing on screen size, ruggedization, or performance. In some cases, you might not be looking at the highest end kind of device, but something a little more affordable. When we talk about configuration, we're really talking about customizing the user experience and the features. But effective mobile solutions often involve custom hardware and accessories too. Again, these will differ by use case, but they should be part of the planning process. Knowing how and where a tablet will be mounted on a kiosk, for example, may impact the decision on device customization that you make down the road. Although our focus here is on management and configuration, I think it's important to talk a bit more specifically about security for a moment and what that means in terms of the team you're going to be pulling together. After all, this is an area where you have, company data being out of the building. In some cases, it might be used in a way that might not mesh with established policies. Joel, what does a security-first approach look like in practice from your perspective?
Well, Shane, I think it means getting everyone important to security as well to that table early, because if you try and patch these security issues or security questions at the end of the project, you can either ruin the user experience, which will turn away users, or in some cases I've seen you can outright kill a project. And as you said, we're talking about mobile data. We're talking about authentication issues. We're talking about issues such as VPN tunnels or biometrics. So some of these things have to be brought in very early during the very first stages in order to ensure a smooth experience. If you're putting that tablet inside of a case, maybe the fingerprint reader isn't going to work. If people have masks on, maybe iris recognition is not going to work. So these issues have to be worked through at the very beginning. And it's not just InfoSec that has to come to that table. As you said, you're trying to bring all of security in a holistic way. So you might have to bring HR, you might have to bring legal, you might have to bring compliance people here to review things, to offer suggestions, check for showstoppers, and make sure that the requirements are being met. So doing this early at this step 3, not at step 20, is really a key to a successful and speedy project.
We might not normally think of authentication as part of the user experience, but it really makes a difference how you ask people to log into a tablet or an individual application. One scenario, for example, might allow employees to use a single sign-on approach for their individual tablet, which means they don't have to log in again to use a specific application. Other environments will require tighter security using a biometric identifier like a fingerprint, for example. That won't work if you're using tablets in a warehouse environment where everyone's wearing gloves, so you need to walk through the journey users will take and balance that out against the level of authentication that the business needs. This is one of the reasons organizations turn to Samsung's Knox Configure, which not only lets them provision tablets, but to set up authentication profiles where settings can be tailored for more specific business needs and updated as required. Joel, what would be the common elements of a Knox Configure profile that companies should be prepared for?
Well, I think as you pointed out, a lot of this is design of the whole project. It's not really specifically tablet customization, but there is a very interesting possibility built into Knox Configure, which is the ability to link profile selection against your corporate Active Directory. So if you're talking about a kiosk, this really doesn't apply. But if you're in an environment where people with different roles in the organization will go to a common place and grab a tablet or a smaller device and use that during a shift, where that tablet might have different roles and requirements and responsibilities, then you can use Knox Configure's authentication profiles to let you have the user log in, and then based on who that user is, completely reconfigure the device for their particular role. Not just the application, but actually the entire device can be matched to their particular role. So it's kind of a neat feature. It's not necessarily something that's going to apply in every project, but it gives you that additional flexibility to have lots of devices that are spread across many, many different roles, instead of thinking, again, in this custom hardware, thinking of general purpose devices that are quickly customized, efficiently customized for the application you need.
So a tool like Knox Configure, or we'll call it KC from here on in, becomes a foundation for customizing tablets because you can essentially create a sort of golden master that then becomes the template for devices throughout an organization. Once that golden master has been tested and approved, it pays long-term dividends because it allows a firm to deploy tablets over and over and more quickly than would otherwise be possible. Unless you're only customizing one tablet for a display, in other words, you'll want to think through your configuration needs from device enrollment and beyond. So, Joel, I know you have experience in using KC. What are some of the ways you would suggest we can customize in this kind of context?
Sure, Shane. Well, KC is based on this concept of a profile. Profile gets pushed out to a device. And I divide these into 5 major categories that control how that device is going to behave once Knox Configure has done its job. And you've got them listed here on this slide. So the user experience, good example. How do you set up wallpapers? What are your favorite applications? How is the sound level set? What fonts are you choosing? What language? What country? What time zone? All of this stuff is built into a profile. You can use application and operating system controls, so you can decide which apps should be preloaded, which are allowed to be run, which are allowed not to be run, what kind of stores are allowed, what application is auto-launched, anything that goes in with an application, including content. So if your application requires some content, like it's a company information application, then that can be preloaded and pushed down by Knox Configure. You also have connectivity settings. You can control your Wi-Fi, your Bluetooth, whether you share location, near-field communications, all this sort of stuff. Cellular data controls can be tightly built into Knox Configure. And then there's a whole ton of security settings. software updates, safe mode, multi-user mode, USB limits, SMS limits, all that kind of stuff can be turned on and off specifically in Knox Configure. So these profiles are defined and then pushed down to devices. But what I think is even more interesting, because you're talking here about what you said is fine-tuning the configuration, the management and the deployment, is the way that Knox Configure supports that aspect. So it's not just defining profiles, because Knox Configure supports you in your operations and management part of your project, not just during the prototyping. Because the profiles are continuously updated. I mean, earlier you talked about a golden master, and the way most IT people think of golden masters is it's something you use to deploy a Windows system, you hand that laptop or desktop off to a user, and then that golden master doesn't get used again. But Knox Configure's golden master, I'm using air quotes here, that's continuously reapplied. And the beauty of this is that when an organization is using these new DevOps style project management, where we don't waterfall, we don't decide on all of our processes and then do our project at the end, but we slowly gain knowledge, we make mistakes, we learn from our mistakes, we tweak the project. Knox Configure supports that because the policies and profiles that you define are continuously, or can be continuously, repushed out to each device in a very automatic way, as long as it's got internet connectivity. So that means you don't have to recall tablets to reimage them with that golden master. You simply push the changes to KC, the changes then get pushed out to the device, and you continue on with your project. So when you have a company that's embracing these new agile methodologies, KC also supports these agile methodologies. And that makes it a great fit, not just for traditional style approaches, but for new kinds of high-speed development and prototyping approaches.
So now that we've talked a little bit about what KC is, we're going to explore a few of the specific use cases that businesses are exploring. We're going to cover 4. This will be the one-time tablet, what we call the restricted device, the enterprise device, and the digital kiosk. We're going to begin with the one-time tablet. These are devices that are deployed once and never updated. So a typical example would be a single event deployment, like a concert, a special meeting, a professional conference, or something like that. Some of these devices may not even be network connected when they're deployed if all the data is local. Of course, one-time tablets are not really one-time, because one of the challenges is retrieving them after the event and then getting them ready quickly for the next event. So think about a museum that is setting up a temporary exhibition and wants to provide tablets that might enhance the experience with visitors using multimedia content. The data may be local, but you still need to be able to get them back and reset them for the next day. Joel, can you give us a sense of how this would look in Knox Configure?
Sure, Shane. Knox Configure makes it very easy to make this kind of one-time versus continuously updated decision. At the very beginning of defining a profile, you select your edition. What's called setup edition on the left is what we're talking about here for one-time. Dynamic edition is one where changes to the profile are pushed to the device. So with setup edition, when the device is powered on, it connects up to the Samsung Cloud, grabs your Knox Configure profile, pulls it down, and completely sets up the device. That's exactly the scenario we're talking about. When the day is over, when the tablet use is done, you wipe all the data off the tablet. You basically clear it back to factory reset, then power it back on, and immediately it goes and grabs the current version of that setup edition that's assigned to that tablet. So you get a fresh, clean tablet. You don't have to worry about whatever might be lingering that's left over from the previous use of the device.
The next use case is what we're calling the restricted device, because there are situations where you may want to limit applications and uses for your devices. These might be locked down to a single application or a set of applications. They're usually handed to a staff member to help with their day-to-day job responsibilities, but with a very restricted set of applications preventing use as a general-purpose tablet. So a typical example here would be a field service technician with 1 or 2 custom applications, plus some very specific or whitelisted web-based applications. Or you could think about a warehouse worker with a tablet wrapped in a special case and with a barcode and RFID readers. These devices are usually tightly locked down and carefully configured, but because they aren't allowed to browse the internet or download new applications, they aren't managed to the same level of detail as an enterprise might do with a bring your own or choose your own device kind of model. Joel, how would you lock down a tablet for this kind of situation and make sure you're only whitelisting what's absolutely necessary using Knox Configure?
Shane, well, I picked a screenshot here that gives you an example of one piece of Knox Configure that helps support this restricted device. You were talking about applications. Now this is just the first screen. You can barely see the scroll bar. There's another 20 or 30 inches worth of content below that. But with the application and content restrictions that are in a Knox Configure profile, you can decide what applications will be loaded, what applications can't be run, what applications will be always started at the beginning of the tablet, what URLs a person can or can't browse to, or whether browsing is completely disabled. You can take that application and preload content that supports it, as I mentioned earlier, and all of that gets wrapped into the profile. So you don't have to worry about whatever might be on that tablet. You can block applications from installation, you can control stores, you can preload applications, you can block applications from running, you can keep applications running in the foreground, and there's a whole bunch of security restrictions that go next to that I haven't shown, which are complementary when you're trying to really restrict how a device is going to be used in a very particular environment.
Restricted tablets have a clear primary purpose, which is to run a specific application, but they are still usable for other functions, such as web browsing. Now, like restricted devices, they're usually network connected. And we've probably all been in a store where we couldn't find the item we wanted, and a store associate had to go behind a counter or into another room to look it up. A tablet that gives them access to inventory information or even point-of-sale capabilities is obviously an opportunity to provide some real-time value. These devices aren't that different from a tablet that someone might buy off the shelf, except that their configuration has been optimized to speed their assigned application. So extraneous uses such as personal email are blocked. Now these are usually managed using the same tools as the enterprise's other mobile devices, which are those covered by a BYOD or a CYOD program. Other examples here for an enterprise device would include healthcare or even financial services. So Joel, how does an enterprise tablet coexist with an organization's MDM or EMM tool?
Shane, it's a bit of a dance between tools like KC Knox Configure and the enterprise's mobile device management, enterprise mobility management infrastructure. So here's a screenshot I picked showing the device connectivity options that you can set up in a Knox Configure profile. And notice you can do things like say, well, I'm going to turn off Wi-Fi, or I'm going to force it to be on. I'm going to predefine maybe some networks that I'm going to connect to. But what you don't see, for example, here might be, and then I'm going to force the user to connect up with a particular VPN using their local authentication before they can get access to any applications. That's really the role of mobile device management, enterprise mobility management, the MDM, EMM tool. So Knox Configure takes you part of the way and complements these MDM, EMM tools. Knox Configure lets you do things that the MDM, EMM tools can't do that are really focused on the hardware and the way that the device behaves as it's being turned on. But then I think for many organizations that are looking at an enterprise kind of environment, which is almost general purpose tablet, you're going to flip over from something like Knox Configure to your MDM, EMM. And Samsung actually has a free tool that helps you jump from Knox Configure to enrollment in your MDM, EMM. And that MDM, EMM then is going to be responsible for taking the device the rest of the life cycle. I mean, you can still make good use of Knox Configure to control certain device attributes that are only available there. But if you have a multi-vendor environment, if you have a multi-operating system environment, if you want to use the same MDM, EMM tool so that your policy matches across BYOD, CYOD, and these restricted enterprise devices, then your MDM, EMM tool is where most of that control is going to occur.
Our next one is something I could see being used in a variety of contexts, but maybe we should define it a bit first. When we say kiosk mode here, we're talking about when a tablet is restricted to a single application or set of applications, and the ability to change settings by the user is more limited. These tablets are network connected and generally mounted in a secure fixed location, like a cabinet or a locking bracket. This is the traditional digital kiosk where the typical user is casual and maybe looking for information or otherwise engages in gentle interaction with the tablet. Some typical examples here would be a digital concierge in a building or another public-private location such as an airport or a meeting room. Joel, can you briefly touch on how KC's Pro Kiosk solution can be applied in this scenario? And if so, can you talk a little bit about how to decide whether this is a fit for your objectives?
Shane, I'm really glad you brought up Pro Kiosk mode. I mean, honestly, deciding it is simple. Either it is a kiosk-type application, just as you outlined, digital signage, locked up in a box, concierge kind of thing, or it's not. If it's a digital signage or kiosk kind of application, you select Pro Kiosk mode. Pro Kiosk mode, which is, again, a kind of a profile that you pick inside of Knox Configure, is one of these little hidden gems. Because without it, you end up having to figure out, well, what is it that I do to really suppress Android and all of these wonderful Android behaviors and turn this thing into just one thing that only does one application and doesn't let the user ever break out, change the volume, turn this on, turn that off, even change the brightness kind of stuff. Pro Kiosk is built into Knox Configure. You don't have to go buy an application or have yet another thing that you're using to manage your devices. You can manage all of your kiosk devices, especially if they're network connected, using Knox Configure in that Pro Kiosk mode. And it's a great setting set from the experts at Samsung that let you turn a device from a general purpose tablet into this very, very specific, very controlled environment without having to worry so much about the details that you might have missed as part of, oh yeah, I didn't realize that I do want to configure whether or not the screen can be rotated if someone shakes the case a little bit kind of thing. So it's a great feature that when you need it really accelerates your ability to deploy in that environment.
Thank you for walking through all those, Joel. I think that was really helpful. I'm not going to dwell long on this last point, but I wanted to note that you can use Knox Configure to customize the Samsung DeX experience as well. If you're not familiar with DeX, it lets you use minimal docking hardware like a display adapter, a keyboard, mouse, and essentially morph a tablet into an Android-based workstation. So it's a way of giving users an experience similar to a Windows PC, for example. Some of the ways that people might use this could be a retail worker who uses a catalog app on a tablet, for instance, but then plugs into a monitor for DeX from time to time. The point here is that with KC, you can customize not just the experience that someone has on the device, but the experience they have in DeX mode. So just to sum up some of the key areas that we focused on so far today. So we talked about, figuring out what makes sense for your business. And, I think Joel's touched on a number of areas that include things like user experience, the customer experience, the cost, and, the security risk as well, and building that security approach up front. We've also talked about the way customization happens, so choosing the right application, but then walking through all the other aspects from hardware add-ons, the way you handle authentication, and of course configuration and management. And we've given you some very specific examples of how that works. I think the underlying message that we're hoping to share today is that with the right configuration tools, there are many options available, and this is a great time to start exploring how you can use them in your business. Also, we've talked a lot about Knox Configure, but I also wanted to put that in the context of Samsung's broader portfolio of mobile security solutions. So Knox Configure is a part of the Knox security platform, but there's also a lot that Samsung offers in terms of mobile device management, anti-malware, and data separation solutions, which is really important in a lot of the personal and professional blended use cases that we see in the enterprise today. You can find out a lot more about that portfolio by clicking on the link you see at the bottom of this slide. Hopefully this webinar gets you started on that journey, but Samsung has a lot more to offer in terms of resources. This includes, of course, the Ultimate Guide to Customizing Tablets, which I'd recommend you download as a complement to this discussion. And with that, we'd like to move to the Q&A portion of this webinar and answer all of your questions.
The first one was saying that it mentioned earlier that we talked about healthcare as one of the markets for enterprise tablets. The question is, how are tablets being customized for those kinds of industries? So I think earlier on we talked very briefly about things like patient intake forms, but there's a number of other ways you could think about this. So one example would be in a clinical setting where you have, patient data is obviously has to be secure, very important from a security perspective. So looking at an enterprise tablet where you can configure your EMM policies so that, for example, you can preload, Knox mobile enrollment or an EMM client, you can, essentially enroll people faster. Then, of course, it's preloading those clinical communications or your electronic health record apps onto the device. And then, as we kind of mentioned earlier, it's also about what you restrict on the device. So anything that's non-essential or that, employees in that setting shouldn't be using, is essentially blocked from them. And then, also things like you might need to restrict the use of the camera and screen capture or things of that nature. So a lot of different use cases depending on the nature of the health organization in question and the kind of role that the user would have, but very easy to kind of get that sort of thing up and running to fit that use case in a healthcare environment. And I think that's probably true of a number of very specific vertical markets and use cases that are coming up where people are realizing tablets, because of some of the features we mentioned earlier around size of screen and lightness and so forth, make a really good fit for giving people access to information that they need. Our next question is around Pro Kiosk. So we've touched on this a little bit and explained a bit about how it's used, but the question is, what's the benefit of Pro Kiosk versus deploying tablets without it? And I'm actually going to pass that to you, Joel, if that's okay, because I think you might have a bit more expertise in that area. So I guess why Pro Kiosk, and I guess if you decide to go down that route, how should you maybe decide whether it's the right fit?
Sure. Thanks, Shane. For me, the thing with Pro Kiosk is you're getting expert support from people that really know these tablets and live and breathe them all day long when you let Knox Configure set up your kiosk mode. So my recommendation is always start with it, because you're probably going to use something like Knox Configure to do a tablet configuration in a kiosk anyway, even if you decide to use some other set of settings. But here you've got these people that know what they're doing, they live and breathe these tablets, and they've set up the settings that in their experience are critical for kiosks, and you get them all as one big fat bundle, and so it becomes super simple. Obviously, there is going to be the possibility that your particular application is different, and maybe you need to buy a special kiosk app. Maybe if you're doing signage, for example, that could be important, or maybe you need to just do it all by hand. But to me, the default is, if I smell a kiosk kind of deployment, to start with something like the built-in settings in KC, because you're getting expertise, not for free, but you're getting expertise from the people that really know these tablets, boom, right there at the very beginning. And it's built in, easy to deploy.
Excellent. Our next question is, should tablets only be customized to work on their own, or are there scenarios that involve a mixture of tablets, smartphones, and wearables? And, we're obviously very focused on tablets in this webinar, but I think, this kind of speaks to the fact that a lot of organizations, if they're looking at digital transformation, it's really not looking at it just from a device standpoint, but from, kind of a process and workflow standpoint. And, I think that there are already today a lot of very specific workflows that, where people working on a smartphone makes sense, where people now are starting to realize actually wearables might create a greater sense of seamlessness for certain kinds of interaction, or the way certain people might need to communicate. I think there will be a mix. I think we're at the beginning of people figuring out how to architect these processes and workflows to essentially drive great customer experiences. It may be more where there's a handoff between applications across devices, or where there still be restricted uses of tablets for certain members of a team, but there'll be other parts of the experience that are enabled by a smartphone or a wearable. So I think this is a time to think creatively around that, and certainly to make use of all the potential mobile devices that we have at our disposal, to essentially provide the best possible experience for customers. This is another question that's a little bit, might be better for you, Joel. It's, the question is, what if your business needs change, which they always do, and you want to bring new features onto a restricted tablet? So you've kind of locked things in where you need them at the moment, but 6 months or even sooner, something else crops up. How do people approach that? How flexible can people be in adapting a restricted tablet to new uses?
Sure. Well, I think the key thing that differentiates Knox Configure in this particular case from some of the other products that are available, some of the other zero-touch enrollment technologies, is this idea of the dynamic profile. And we talked a little bit about it as an example when we talked about the opposite, which was the static profile, the single-use tablet. And make a change and have that change be pushed out as long as the tablet has some kind of network connectivity, whether it's cellular, Wi-Fi, as long as it can get out to Samsung land, out on the internet, and see that Knox Configure portal. As you have a business need change and you're like, oh no, I need to add a new app, I need to change some data, I need to, I don't know, go to a new version of the app or launch it in a slightly different way, that's no problem if you're using the dynamic edition version of KC.
Excellent. And then this question is, what if the applications you need for a custom tablet aren't readily available, and you don't have a lot of experience developing them internally? So I think this is probably something that a lot of organizations might be grappling with, depending on whether they've already used a lot of mobile apps before, or have started to explore the potential around them. One thing I would draw people's attention to, so on the Samsung Insights blog, I actually covered the Samsung Developer Conference, where there was a lot of news around how Samsung is trying to help organizations address, what's historically been kind of the enterprise app gap. Where obviously there's a ton of tools available for consumers to enjoy these devices, but really, businesses, trying to catch up to some of the ways that it can help in their business. I'd also draw attention to some of the news that's come out around the Knox Partner Program. So, there's a lot of resources that Samsung's making available today to help people think through that entire process of, discovering, building, going to market and growing with applications. And, certainly a marketplace there that's available for people to look at, whether they might be smartphone apps that a developer has created today, but may have the capabilities to assist with if either they have something that can be readily deployed today, or that could be, perhaps, custom developed and that they could partner with. I think those are all the questions that we have at the moment. And if there's any other questions that come through in the next few minutes, we'll make sure that we can follow up from Samsung to provide that. So with that, I am going to say that I'd like to thank Joel again for sharing his time and his considerable expertise. There will be an archived version of this webinar available shortly. Please watch your inbox for notification when the archive is available, and be sure to share it with your colleagues. We hope that we see you at future Samsung webinars, but for now, this is Shane Schick signing off and wishing you a great day.